Yeah. Good evening. Thank you very much for this introduction. I hope I will meet expectations. And also, in general, thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate that. And I've been glad to come to Gießen. And I'm also not only happy to give this lecture, but I also would like to encourage you to have a discussion with me. So afterwards, of course. Okay. Okay. My topic is on the slide. The culture model of disability as an analytical tool. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a culture studies scientist. And I'm also specializing in the field of disability studies. So probably I'm going to present a quite special approach, maybe, to culture and to disability. And you can then see if you like it or not. Okay, I'm starting with this quote, which comes from the well-known culture studies scholar Leonard J. Davis, a U.S. American scholar, it's published. It was published in his introduction to the first edition of the Disability Studies Reader of 2006. And this scholar expressed, I think, an experience which other colleagues and surely myself feel that's quite convincing. So he says, when it comes to disability, normal people are quite willing to volunteer solutions, present anecdotes, recall from a vast array of films instances they take for fact. No one would dare to make such a leap into Heideggerian, philosophy, for example, or the art of the Renaissance. But disability seems so obvious, a missing limb, blindness, deafness. What could be simpler to understand? One simply has to imagine the loss of the limb, their absent sense, and one is halfway there. Even today, with the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted in December 2006, and disability-related discourses, structures, and practices gradually changing throughout the world according to this new human rights approach. Even today, there are many people who still take disability as a simple natural fact. However, it's not only normal people who tend to estimate the complexity of disability. Often, academia itself chooses to apply somewhat undifferentiated approaches to this phenomenon. Against this background, I intend in the following to explain my own understanding of a culture model of disability. So I draw on the approach of disability studies, which I'm not going to explain in full detail, but instead I want to claim the relevance of culture as an analytical category for the study of disability. I want, in the following, first differentiate several fields of research that focus on disability. I will then very shortly explore the notion of culture. Then I will appreciate the so-called social model of disability, and after that I want to provide an overview on earlier attempts of conceptualizing a culture studies approach to disability. I then want to offer an analytical perspective that uses the concept of disability and understands this category as affected by symbolic orders, bodily practices, and social institutions. And I also have brought with me an example to highlight the heuristic value of the culture model of disability for both research and practice. I come to that in my quite last part, actually. But before I finish, I want to discuss some possible pitfalls of a culture studies approach to disability. This is a quite full program. We will see how it goes with the time. So tell me when I'm running out of time and I will stop. Okay. Looking at disability, medicine, rehabilitation sciences, psychology, education, and social policy research still and normally dominate this academic field. Of course, these disciplines have their merits, and it's not my intention to dismiss the efforts of providing support and services for persons with disabilities altogether. But these disciplines just cover only parts of a more complex story. Established approaches to disability tend to regard disability as a given fact, and they assume that it's mainly the functional limitation that prevents a person from performing tasks in normal ways. They adhere, in short, to an individual model of disability, and they believe that everything begins from the impairment by presupposing that there are bodily, mental, or psychological conditions that cause restrictions of participation and result in disability. So I claim that individualistic approaches are by no means outdated. They govern current practices in, for example, education. From an individual model perspective, the appropriate social response to learning problems is to treat impairments such as hyperactivity disorder or the like by therapeutic intervention and to support the individual child to come to terms with his or her deficits. I call these approaches conventional disability research. In contrast to them, disability studies claims that disability is not just a health problem or a developmental disorder to be resolved or managed, but a difference constructed in and through society and culture. In the case of inclusive education, for example, disability studies scholars would point out that school systems and classroom cultures are the source of many so-called special educational needs. These studies argue that we should not direct our perspectives or our viewpoints on the supposedly heavy plight of disabled persons and demand from them to adapt and accept their conditions as the individual model of disability does, but instead we should focus on the role of social barriers in the making of disability. It is disability studies that has developed the social model of disability. Proponents of this model question the idea that there is any necessary causality between having an impairment and becoming disabled. While they would concede that there are natural characteristics or medical symptoms, such as blindness, for example, they argue that the reaction to impairment varies in certain periods of time and depending on cultural and social circumstances. For example, whether blindness is considered as being connected with the gift of prophecy or a sixth sense, as something to make fun of, or as deserving our pity and our charity, is highly contingent and says more about their reacting environment than about the blind persons concerned. Physical, cognitive, or sensory impairments are not in themselves disadvantages or stigmata. The problem is society's failure to accept human diversity and to pay respect to the differences of their members. That's the main argument of the social model of disability. It has been developed in the UK and in the US. Basically, both American and British approaches converge in their emphasis on the relevance of society with regard to disability. The same applies to other disability models developed in the following years, since the 80s, often in competition to the social model, but very much alike and also disputable in their innovative power. However, this discourse, the discourse of disability studies, has not come to a halt at this point over recent years. Disability studies itself has become more diversified, and among the different types that have enriched the spectrum is so-called critical disability studies. This field of research adds a self-reflexive stance to disability and to the field, and intends to make use of critical social theory, such as the Frankfurt School of the 30s or post-structuralism in the tradition of Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and others. Critical disability studies also has the intention to thoroughly reflect its own conceptual frameworks. Critical disability studies links up with another type, namely cultural disability studies. This field applies the tools of discipline that at first sight look as if they have nothing to do with disability, such as philosophy, ethnology, literary studies, linguistics, media studies, religious studies, and so on. In this respect, it differs from critical disability studies that uses more the repertoire of social sciences and is less a field in the humanities. So far, a great number of cultural and literary analyses on disability have already been published. Undoubtedly, research that draws from both culture studies and disability studies has already begun to cross language borders, nationalities, as well as disciplinary boundaries. While I would agree with British disability studies scholar David Bolt, who is also doing literary science, who states that cultural disability studies is growing as an interdisciplinary field of inquiry, I'm a bit more reluctant to observe only achievements. Rather, I'm inclined to ask what are the underlying models of disability that link all these different contributions of cultural disability studies to a basic framework and serve as the methodological guidelines for newcomers to the field. In general, my argument is that disability studies needs more theorizing, and discussing only models is not sufficient for and in academic work. In what follows, I intend to sketch an approach that links both critical and cultural disability studies by devising a culture model that is critical at the same time as it builds on the notion of disability. To begin with the construction of such a model, the first step is to ask this essential question: what is culture? Of course, I will be very short in this section. Much like disability, culture is a contested and contestable terrain. When drawing on culture in research, one needs to be aware that it's not only very diverse, maybe it's even an empty signifier, diverse notion, but also an interdisciplinary concept. It has a transnational linguistic history, and of the several academic disciplines that use culture as a key term, of course, cultural anthropology is at the forefront, and cultural anthropology is mostly linked with North American scholarship. Here, culture originally served to to study the patterns of learned and shared behavior and customs, knowledge and technologies, and beliefs and habits of particular ethnic or cultural groups. In recent years, culture anthropology has preferred to apply a broader approach, according to which culture denotes the totality of things created and employed by a particular people or society, which can be material or immaterial. That means it deals with objects, instruments, institutions and organizations, ideas, knowledge, symbols and values, meanings and interpretations, narratives and histories, traditions, rituals and customs, social behavior, attitudes and identities. With sociology as my academic background, I find it additionally helpful to draw on cultural sociology, which can also look back to a history transcending borders of languages and nations. Prominent figureheads of the new discipline of sociology in the late 19th century or in the early 20th century, such as Emile Durkheim in France, Max Weber and Georg Simmel in Germany, and Tucker Parsons in the United States, and they all conducted their studies of society by following the premise that culture and society are very much linked with each other. However, in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, as a side effect of the then dominant empirical approach, the issue of culture was pushed into the background in mainstream sociology. A special sociology of culture emerged, implying that culture is only one field of sociological analysis, and other sociologies could ignore its relevance. It needed the culture change from the late 60s onwards, the rise of post-structuralism in the tradition of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida and others, and also the birth of culture studies in the United Kingdom, which combined Marxism and discourse theory and new methodologies within French sociology, such as Pierre Bourdieu's way of combining ethnological work, social structural analysis, and practicality to make possible a renewed attention to culture as an analytical category essential for a full understanding of society. Within this sociological framework, and especially with reference to Foucault and Bourdieu, which are the authors I like to work with myself, culture becomes a category that is very much linked to social inequality and domination. Culture practices, in short, serve to stabilize hegemonic orders. They are very much linked to power. Culture studies, based on such an approach, seeks to examine the construction of categories as forms of human differentiations and the reactions to persons who are regarded as the others as socio-culture power plays. These short remarks on culture and culture studies should surface in the context of this lecture. I'm now turning to my main topic, the discussion of different disability models. I already mentioned the social model of disability. Since its introduction in the late 70s or early 80s, if you like, the social model of disability has changed disability discourses in many countries and globally. You probably have this question, what is it about? This model emphasizes that basically that disability is a social construction. It implies the following three assumptions. First, disability is a form of social inequality, and disabled persons are a minority in society. Second, impairment and disability need to be distinguished and do not have a causal relation. Third, it's a society's responsibility to remove the obstacles that persons with disabilities are facing. So basically, the social model of disability is a social science model of disability. When the social model was introduced first by disability rights organizations and then developed further by activists and academics such as Vic Finkelstein, Michael Oliver, Colin Barnes in the UK, and Ed Roberts, Simi Linton, Irving Kenneth Zola in the United States, it really was revolutionary, and it offered a new way of thinking. Especially in the UK, it was based on neo-Marxist thinking, and the proponents of this model emphasized the role of industrial capitalism with its exploitative working conditions, which they identified as main cause for the exclusion and segregation of disabled persons, whose manpower or women power, if you like, was considered of minor or no value in the capitalist production process. In short, in the early phase, the social model of disability implied a radical critique of capitalist society and its exclusionary mechanism. However, in the course of the time, the social model has become the victim of its own success. One reason may be that its core idea is fairly easy to understand. It's not this impairment, but society that matters. So it's not the disabled person's fault if he or she is marginalized and excluded. So that means that instead of blaming the victim, the social model argues that the full and equal participation of persons with disability is a social issue. As a result, this model has proven an all-rounder. It emerged as a useful tool for both academic discourse, disability rights activism, and also for the individual, for the lay persons and their identity politics. So that means, in sum, the social model has witnessed a quite successful career over the last decades. However, this success has had its drawbacks. Applying the social model of disability in practice has basically resulted in pragmatist approaches and the conception that disability can be solved through accessibility instruments, through participation, disability mainstreaming, and human rights policies. In spite of its relevance for international disability politics, right from its beginning, however, until the present day, the social model of disability has also frequently been criticized. I'm not going so much into detail on this point, but it's interesting to see that the approach has stood firm so far against this criticism. However, I would argue that it seems nowadays a bit dusty, and probably also because of current societal and cultural trends, it's time to rethink or amend even the conception. Certainly, we still live in a capitalist society, but despite this continuity, we have witnessed not only great changes of industrial relations, but also fundamental transformations in the last decades since the social model of disability has been devised. Nowadays, it seems a bit simplistic to blame only capitalism for the present challenges in society or what regards disability. What is the meaning of the disability divide today in this century against the background of a globalized world in economic and ecological crisis, facing new power relations and a digital revolution, the questioning of democracy and the rule of law? worried by the rise of nationalism, international terrorism, and unconventional forms of warfare, divided by cultural clashes and growing inequalities. I guess that contemporary disability discourse has also to deal with these big questions. Against this background, there's a question to be raised. Do we need maybe a new and a more critical disability again? Or, in other words, do we need a culture model of disability? When it comes to culture, the social model of disability is not very inspiring. Katie Ellis has claimed that neglecting cultural imagery belongs to the gaps of the social model. However, Michael Oliver, one of the founding fathers, if you like, of the social model in the UK, has reacted to this critique, to many of his of the critique. But with regard to the argument of neglecting cultural representation, he has confirmed the interpretation of his critics, as he claimed that he does not consider cultural values to be very crucial, at least as long, so he argues, as many persons with disabilities are still suffering from poverty and material deprivation. Well, this assessment is understandable in terms of practical politics, but it's still astonishing from my point of view, and also from my point of view as a sociologist, and Michael Oliver is a sociologist as well. This argument clearly underestimates the role and the relevance of cultural practices in and for society and their influence on our understanding of disability. Okay, in parallel with the social model of disability and its critical discussion, past decades have also witnessed an increase in cultural disability studies. This field has proven to develop as an innovative and prolific research field carried out in many disciplines, and of course especially in the humanities. I'm not going to explain this slide in detail. What I just want to argue is that it's striking that, in contrast to the social model of disability, which, as I have tried to explain, which is characterized by strong coherence, the culture model of disability is rather implicit amidst an ongoing discussion on the implications of culture for disability constructions. So that means, to say it in other words, there are many works working or drawing on culture studies approaches to work, and they work on disability, but there is no culture model of disability so far. So my contention is that critical disability studies and culture disability studies would profit from a deeper methodological discussion and a more clearly defined cultural model. So in my following parts, I just explain my own perspective. So I'm trying to outline a culture model of disability, and for this task, I can draw on some efforts, similar efforts, which can be witnessed over time and across disability studies community. Again, we are confronted with a transnational conversation. As early, actually, as 1994, British disability studies scholar and sociologist Tom Shakespeare called for a stronger perception of cultural representations of disabled people. He suggested that disabled people were objectified by cultural representations, under which he is subsumed theory, literature, paintings, films, and the media. Some years later, in 2002, American culture studies scholar Rosemary Carlin Thompson argued for understanding disability as a category of analysis and knowledge, as a culture trope and an historical community. In 2005, Patrick de Vlieger, who teaches cultural anthropology in Leuven in Belgium, pleaded for a dialectical cultural model to study intersections between migration, ethnicity, race, so-called race, and disability. However, he never elaborated this interesting approach. Instead, in a collection published in 2016, he argues that the culture model approach, as it stands, remains an unfinished project that requires continued updates. In 2006, again, US American culture studies and disability studies scholars Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell explicitly used the expression culture model of disability, but they defined it quite narrowly as an approach that was primarily associated with US American disability studies. In this context, they introduced the phrase culture locations of disability. And with this phrase or concept, if you like, they offered a tool for critical works on disability within and beyond culture studies. However, in terms of the culture model, they remained rather vague. Frequently, the literature is content with only presenting short definitions. In 2010, there was a fourth volume of the Edinburgh German Yearbook, which dealt with disability in German literature, film, and theatre. And in this context, Joshua and Schillmeier described the culture model as the analysis, I quote, the analysis of the representations of disabled people in the cultural spaces of art, media, and literature. And they also speak of a culture turn in disability studies. There are also recent works in post-colonial studies that ask the question of, I quote again, of how disability is figured in the global post-colonial history of the modern. And these studies aim to highlight specific located examples of disability in culture contexts. There's also religious studies which uses the culture model of disability as a key term. Junior and Schipper define it in this context as an approach that analyzes how a culture's representations and discussions of disability help to articulate a range of values, ideas, and expectations that are important to that culture's organizations and identity. And in his second edition of his Introduction to Disability Studies, a popular book in the UK, critical disability studies scholar Dan Godley reviewed the culture model of disability, but he only did that with special regard to English-speaking works. But he also did not provide a concise definition either. So, again, my impression is that there's a great wealth of works doing culture disability studies, but the culture model of disability still has blurred features. Comprehensive explanations are lacking. With regard to Germany, which is the country we are just in, so the discussion on how to use the repertoire of culture studies for exploring questions surrounding disability can also be witnessed. As early as the beginning of this century, two international and interdisciplinary conferences on disability took place, 2001 in Dresden, 2002 in Berlin, and both focused on the cultural history of disability. They were part of a unique and major exhibition titled The Imperfect Human Being, that was presented in Dresden at the Deutsche Hygienemuseum and in Martin Gropius Bau in Berlin. The results of these two conferences were published in a collection with the same title in 2003, and Thomas Macho, who is a prominent culture studies scholar from Humboldt University, Berlin, and at least known in German-speaking contexts, acted as one of the editors of this collection. A further conference on culture studies perspective on disability took place 2 years later as part of a summer university on disability studies in German at the University of Bremen. And the results of this conference were also published in 2003. In 2007, we started an interdisciplinary book series which is called Disability Studies, Body, Power, Difference, and this is published by transcript and edited by myself and other colleagues representing culture studies, sociology, and educational science. By now, 11 books have been published in this context, and further publications are in preparation. And in addition, an international collections on so-called encounters between disability studies and culture studies came out in 2017, edited by myself and colleagues from the Institute of American Literature and Culture at the University of Cologne in 2012. Actually, this collection is based on an international conference in 2012, which had the title Contact Zones. So it very nicely links to this, to the title of this series of lecture here in Gießen. So here at this point, my sketchy overview of the state of art in culture disability studies ends. I now turn to the question, how could a culture model of disability look like? So a culture model that can be used as an analytical tool. In the following, I'm referring to earlier works of myself and also published by me and Werner Schneider, another colleague of mine. So we argue that a culture model of disability needs to reflect, first of all, its own understanding of culture. And we would also argue that for innovative research, it is more productive to apply a rather broad conception of culture instead of concentrating on culture in the conventional and narrow sense. If culture studies or culture disability studies uses a general understanding of culture, it will be able to focus not only on symbols and meanings, but it could investigate the relations between knowledge, between categorization and institutionalization processes, material artifacts, practices, ways of doing things, and their consequences for not only the individual members, but also for society at large. Thus, we think that a culture model of disability could differ from other approaches in important aspects. It should not consider disability as the individual model of disability does, only as an individual fate, and neither should it regard disability as the social model of disability does, as merely an effect of discrimination and exclusion. Rather, this model should question the other side of the coin, the commonly unchallenged normality or normalcy in American English, and it should investigate how practices of or normalization result in the social category we have come to call disability. As a consequence of this shift in focus, four programmatic ideas arise. First, a culture model of disability should regard neither disability nor impairment as supposedly clear-cut categories of pathological classification. Rather, this model should consider impairment, disability, and normality as effects generated by academic knowledge, mass media, everyday discourses, and so on. Basically, these concepts or words or ideas are empty signifiers. They refer to a mixture of different physical, psychological, cognitive features that have nothing else in common than negative, or, as in the case of ability and normality, positive attribution from society. In short, the culture model should consider disability not as a given fact or entity, but it should describe it as a discourse, as a process, as an experience, a situation, or an event. Second, following this premise, disability should not regarded as an individual's feature, but as an always embodied and thus materialized category of differentiation. Disability is not true or real, but it is taken as true and as real. It's not a natural fact, but a naturalized difference. It exists only and insofar as certain both bodily or embodied differences can be distinguished and thought of as relevant for health within a given cultural and historical order of knowledge. Third, the culture model of disability should claim that both disability and ability relate to prevailing symbolic orders and institutional practices of producing normality and deviance, the self and the other, familiarity and alterity. By assuming a contingent character of disability, the history and cultural relativity of inclusion and exclusion, stigmatization and recognition can come into consideration. Thus, a culture model of disability can show that the individual and collective subjectivities of so-called disabled and non-disabled persons are interdependent, they are intersecting. Fourth, the culture model of disability promises that when one employs this decentering approach, surprising new insights can become possible, insights into our late modern societies. So that means instead of continuing to stare only at persons with disabilities, asking what kinds of problems they are confronted with and how society should support them, the focus could widen to look at society and culture in general and to the aim to understand the dominant ways of problematizing issues of health, normality and functioning. How is the knowledge of the body produced, transformed and mediated? How are normalities and deviations are constructed? How are identities and new forms of subjectivities are created and shaped with reference to disability? These are, I think, the basic questions. Summing up, the culture model of disability starts with the premise that impairments and disabilities are structuring culture or cultures, and at the same time are structured and lived through culture. With this basic assumption, culture disability studies is, first, critical to the rehabilitation paradigm and to individualistic models of disability. Second, it draws on deconstructivist, phenomenological, post-structuralist, post-materialist, and other theoretical approaches. And third, it applies the critique of society. As a consequence, it changes disability studies. Like this one, yes. As a consequence, it changes disability studies into disability studies. The introduction of the slash indicates that one should no longer problematize only the category of disability, but rather focus on the interplay between normality and disability. In short, the transversal and intersectional should become the main focus of research. Okay, so far my keynote has centered on methodological reflections. Of course, this question needs answering. Is this discussion really important for the actual living situation of persons with disabilities? And does it actually make a difference in concrete practice or research if one applies the cultural model and not, for example, other models of disability, such as the individual model or the social model? I have brought with me one example. I'm referring to the book which has just been mentioned. I think I would translate it like this: self-determination or personal autonomy, if you like, as a construction. It deals with subjective theories of men and women with disabilities. But I'm not sure whether I'm running out of time already. Do I still have some time for this part? Okay, thank you. Okay, so in the following, I want to consider what happens when the culture model of disability is put in action, as Michael Oliver has put it. What does this in actual fact mean, and which new insights could the culture model lead to? So I'm using my own book, my own study, and this study includes two parts. First, I analyzed both general and disability-related discourses on personal autonomy. And second, I conducted guided interviews with persons with different impairments, asking them about their understandings of personal autonomy and their experiences with independent living. I collected this data in the late 90s, actually, so it's a bit old already, but I think the issue is still topical, or even more so in the present, because one has to consider that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Disability Rights Convention in short, stipulates in its Article 19 that persons with disabilities have the right to live independently and being included in the community. So it's a very hot issue again, and has been over the last decades, because there are many persons with disability who have not the right or access to independent living yet. So, but still, for the reason of time, I cut a longer story short, and will in the following focus only on the questions which arise when one starts to either do research on the subject of independent living, or simply wants to reflect what this means in relation to disabled people's personal lives and experiences. My argument is that these questions, and of course also the resulting research practice, vary greatly according to the respective model one is applying. The following, or this table, includes, for the reason of completeness, the individual model, which I have already mentioned as a kind of contrast to the social and cultural model of disability, or as a kind of contrast to disability studies approaches. Okay, this table displays, I think, clear differences between conventional disability research and critical disability studies. At the same time, it also shows the differences between the two approaches, the social model of disability and the cultural model of disability, that both are important in disability studies. First, if you start research, you probably have to ask questions about the relation between autonomy and disability. And already these starting questions, they vary significantly according to which model one does research with. The individual model asks, are the disabled really able to live independently. The social model instead would ask what societal conditions prevent the personal autonomy or the self-determination of disabled people. The culture model would ask what means personal autonomy and independent living in a given culture, history, and society. Second, when one wants to deal with the ways of doing independent living, or when one wants to consider implementation and problems resulting from the efforts to implement or to realize independent living, the three models also imply different questions. If you work with an individual model, you probably are inclined to ask what ways of empowerment should the professionals provide for disabled people. The social model, in contrast, would ask which arrangements of support services, personal assistance, and accessible environments should a society provide to help to tear down barriers and to enable independent living in the community. Again, the culture model asks a different question. It probably asks, why is personal autonomy so important in late modern societies? Which normative expectations, promises, and constraints are connected with it? Third, when it comes to outcomes or impacts of the principle of personal autonomy on the real, that means everyday life of persons with disabilities, again, the three models raise different questions. The individual model asks, how can institutions allow for more self-determination for the disabled? The social model would be asking, how is Article 19 of the CRPD, which is the convention, implemented, and with which outcomes for persons with disabilities? But the culture model asks, how does doing independent living take place in everyday life, and which experiences are connected with it? Summing up, it does make a great difference which model of disability is being used. The social model, I think, poses important questions, and it certainly has its merits, as does the individual model, I believe. But as a disability studies scholar, I tend to use rather the social model than the individual model. But it is the culture model which provides an additional and a wider perspective, and it inspires us to both historicize and generalize the issue in question. I'm now coming to my last point of this talk. So far I have centered on the strength of the culture model, and you could argue, well, this is really more or less a promotional campaign in favor for this approach. Of course, as I said, when one wants to undertake critical disability studies, that means one needs also to apply a self-reflexive stance to our tools and methods. So, of course, we have to deal with the question, what are the weaknesses of the culture model of disability? Again, I cut a longer story short, and I only want to highlight these 5 problems which I can identify in regard to the culture model. First, very often the approach is often often understood as a theory, but of course any model is only a heuristic device. It's not a theory. Instead, it has to be complemented by the art of theorizing. So we can't be content with just starting with a model and ending up there, but we have to use this kind of perspective as an inspiration and also as a demand. We have to develop innovative, groundbreaking theories and methodologies, starting with this kind of heuristic. Second, the culture model of disability bears the risk to focus on culture only in a narrow sense. So it tends to analyze fine art theory, theater, films, literature, and so on. But it should also do research on everyday life, on culture, on everyday culture in relation to disability. Yet, in other words, it should aim to consider the full spectrum and the diversity of culture in a rather general sense, as I have already argued. Third, culture disability studies too often focuses on symbols, meanings, and discourses, or beliefs, values, customs, and attitudes. And this field of research has a lot of ground to make up as regards analyzing material things, objects, artifacts, machines, technologies, and institutions as concrete objectivizations of culture. It needs studying how these elements relate to disabled persons' life and what persons with disabilities do with them. Fourth, my impression is that culture disability studies is somewhat inclined towards overestimating the significance of culture. Of course, in the full sense of the term, culture matters, but at the same time, both its history and its intersections and entanglements with society at large, as well as the economy and the political system, need consideration as well. Fifth, there is the risk that studies that draw on the culture model ignore or neglect power relations and issues of domination, violence, and inequality in society. Referring to theories of power and hegemony is necessary to fully understand the role of culture. And we also have to consider that culturalization is often a means, or it is applied as a strategy to disguise the actual conditions and power relations in our capitalist society. At this point, we come full circle. The culture model cannot do without the social model because this model highlights the roles of systems, structures, and conditions. At the same time, the social model cannot do without the culture model either, since culture and society are necessarily intersected with each other. So I now come to my conclusion. I've tried to show that culture studies on disabilities as a practice have flourished over the last decades. They cross-cut already different academic disciplines, and they are also transnational as regards languages and contexts. But what remains necessary is to reflect on the theories, methodologies, and concepts of these studies. Of course, bringing disability and culture together does not progress smoothly and in harmony. It involves conversations, debates, and controversies. In one word, as Louise Brett has said, contact zones between and among different discourses. I think the culture model of disability offers conflictual yet productive spaces through which new and critical ways of thinking can emerge. Okay, I come to my last remark. I want to finish my lecture by coming back to my start. I want to cite Leonard Davis again. He said in the Disability Studies Reader, while most normists, and I would like to add academics also, think they understand the issue of disability and can speak with knowledge on the subject, we need to commence from the assumption that in fact we do not. My point here is that the belief that one is lacking knowledge seems a good point of departure for new journeys into many other new unknown cultural, societal, any words of disability. Thank you very much.